title of this panel is American Reckoning, Threats to the First Amendment in the Trump Era. What I thought I'd do is give just a few minutes background of what the First Amendment is, not assuming everybody knows what it is, and a little very thumbnail sketch of American history that brought us there, and then introduce our three panelists. In the 1700s, when America declared its independence, we had 13 states, each of whom was fairly autonomous and interested in the way they governed themselves. So when the gentlemen, and they were all gentlemen, got together to form a nation and write a constitution, many of those states were worried that the federal government, the central government, would rule them in a way they didn't like. And so the compromise for the anti-federalists was what has become known as the American Bill of Rights. And these are 10 amendments to the American Constitution. The first of which encodes freedom of expression. And I thought I would read these 45 amazing words and consider all that they protect, but they only eventually protect it with a judiciary, a citizenry, and actions. But here are the 45 words of the First Amendment that many are wondering whether it's under threat in this new age. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to perform and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That was passed in December 1791. In those 45 words, and it was very illustrative for me as a writer to consider what the precision of language can do. The separation of church and state was established, freedom of religion was established, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. So, pivoting off of that, I'll now introduce our panel. To my right, and he'll speak first, is Paul Auster. Many of you know him as a novelist, 17 novels, the latest of which has just been made a finalist for the Man Booker Prize. His work has been translated into 40 languages. He's also an author of nonfiction. Next to Paul is Drew Menaker, who's the Chief Operating Officer and Director of the International Partnerships for PEN American Center. Drew is a longtime advocate for freedom of expression, and in her earlier career, she was a foreign correspondent, an editor, and a bureau chief for Associated Press, and has reported from around the world. And to my left is Larry Siems, who many of you know from his longtime work both at PEN American Center as the director of the Freedom to Write work, but also as a regular participant in PEN International Congresses. And Larry is also the author of several books, the most recent of which is Guantanamo Diaries, which many of you know because it's gotten much international attention. So let me turn to Paul, who will try to pivot from American history to what the world looks like in America today relating to freedom of expression.
As you all know, we had an election in America last November. As you all know, we have a new president. And as you all know, things in America and the world have gotten very, very strange. I feel that we are walking into new territory, places where we as Americans have never been in the 200 and X number of years we've been a country. The administration has undertaken to, I think, undo most of the work that has been accomplished over the past 100 years in terms of progress for equality in the United States. The press issue and the freedom of speech issue is just one part of a much larger global attitude, which is, let me put it this way. I think until now, most Americans have believed in the solidity of our institutions. The institution, for example, being that First Amendment to the Constitution, that those institutions being our legal system and the manner of government that we've established. America is probably alone in the world of having always a peaceful transition of power. One party wins, the other one loses, and the losers have never contested the results. There's never been an attempted coup, and there's never been any violence over political results in elections. Well, we believe in the solidity of these institutions, but my fear now is that the new administration has turned its hoses on that granite building that we've always believed in. And we will see, and it's too early to know, but we will see whether the building is actually made of granite or if it's made out of soap. And if it is made out of soap, it's all going to melt, and it'll just start dissolving into suds running through the gutters of the streets. So that's my great fear, is the challenge to the very institutions that have kept America going. All right, let's talk about freedom of expression and freedom of the press. At this point, nobody in the administration is attacking a poet or a novelist, as far as I know, for what he or she is writing. I don't feel that the arts are in any imminent danger from this new administration. Of course, it's an administration that has no interest in the arts, and they are about to defund, if they can get it through Congress, defund all the support the federal government gives to the arts. It's an organization called the National Endowment for the Arts, which dispenses grants. Well, they want to get rid of that. But still, that is not suppressing speech. Where I think we are running into danger is particularly in the press. And by press, I mean particularly newspapers, but also radio and television, and television news. The new president, it's very hard for me to say his name. I dislike him so intensely. I tend to call him number 45, so as not to have to say the name out loud. Number 45, I think we all understand, is not a well person. He's I think, demented. I think, at the very least, he is what we would call a malignant narcissist, a man who lives only for himself, a man who lives to be seen by others, a man who lives to be heard by others. And it seems that he has no convictions, no beliefs of any kind whatsoever, except the furtherance of his gigantic ego, which is at the same time a very fragile ego, easily wounded. Well, the most important statement that he has made since taking office, which sent a chill right down my spine, was, "The press is the enemy of the people." Now, no American president has ever said this. And this has eerie echoes with the dark, ugly things that happened in the world in the 20th century. I'm talking about fascism. I'm talking about a authoritarian idea about how to run a government. Because this man who is now in charge he's not only ignorant of such things as the First Amendment and how the government actually works, I believe he's stupid. And when you're stupid and ignorant at the same time, the possibility of learning anything is reduced to zero. So what we're seeing is what we're going to continue to get. Don't expect a sudden reversal in this man's behavior or the way he thinks. The irony of this is that he is obsessed with the press, more so than anyone I've ever seen in public life. He reads what they're writing about him, he listens to what they're saying about him on television, and he's obsessively viewing everything, particularly television, because, alas, the man does not like to read. And the memos that his staff gives him at the White House are, by design, no longer than one page, and with illustrations, if possible. He has said that he doesn't like to read books because he doesn't like the way books smell. It's all on the record. He said it. At the same time that we have had this attack on the press by number 45 and the members of his party, but particularly the man himself, who has tried to devalue the work of honest, earnest journalists doing the job of trying to uncover the truth about whatever it is that happens to be going on. The failing New York Times, that's how he describes that paper. The New York Times is not failing. Attacking the Washington Post, attacking CNN, the news organ on television, attacking MSNBC, another station. While at the same time, we have a new phenomenon that is growing, growing across America rapidly. It's been with us in small doses until now, but I'm talking about the so-called alternative press, the press of alternative truths. What an amazing phrase that is, alternative truths. So that the public is at the same time being fed information if they want to see it. I think most of this is happening online and also on radio. So you have to make an effort. You have to turn on the radio station to the person you want to listen to, and you have to go onto your computer to read these websites of the far, far right. But if you take the trouble to look at these things, you'll see that the reality of the world is distorted. Everything is turned into a conspiracy. So that, for example, number 45, after he was elected, but not by a majority of the public, but because of our system in the Electoral College, he won fair and square, but his opponent got more votes than he did. Well, it was hard for his ego to take such a truth, and so he has been lying about it ever since, saying that that these votes were made by people who didn't have the right to vote, and he's even established an election investigation committee to look into this, but there's nothing to find because there was no cheating among the voters in the last election. So while this attack on the press is going on, it's remarkable to see that he has set up a cabinet, and maybe in Europe you're not as aware of this aspect of the new administration. Nearly every agency of the federal government is now headed by somebody whose mission, it seems to me, is to destroy the very agency he or she is working for. So, for example, we have a Secretary of Health who doesn't believe in health insurance for people. We have a head of the Environmental Protection Agency, which deals with the environment, who has spent his life as Attorney General of Oklahoma, suing the very agency he's now heading in cases brought forth by oil companies and utility companies. So he's out to destroy the agency. On the websites now of the EPA, as it's called, the words global warming have been suppressed. This is not allowed anymore. Scientists who worked for the EPA have quit or have been fired. See, because as we're going through this chilling moment of untruth, we're also being led by people who don't believe in science, which is also a kind of truth, isn't it? So you have a Secretary of Education who doesn't believe in public schools. You have a Secretary of Labor who doesn't believe in protecting workers. On and on, down the list, we have an Attorney General who is the head law officer of the United States who doesn't believe in civil rights and equal rights for all people. So we're living in a nightmare, I think, and it's not just number 45, but it's everyone he's encircled himself with are so frightening to me that I'm afraid that if they can get through what they're proposing to do, that building will melt and it will turn out to be made of soap. The one redeeming hope in all this is that they are so incompetent that they really haven't been able to do too much in the legislature at this point. But I'm praying that they will continue to be incompetent and that 4 years will go by without the world being blown up or newspapers being shut down or journalists being arrested, and that finally we can wake up from this nightmare. That's my prayer.
Thank you, Paul. With that, as we all know, words encompass ideas and lead, but they have to have frameworks, people around them. And so Drew will talk about one of the important frameworks and then hopefully pivot to the others. And that framework is the civil society, and in particular PEN, but also the judiciary, the citizenry, and what we find actually standing up for the values that have been challenged. So Drew?
Thank you, Joanne. It's okay. So as you may have noticed from Paul's comments, we are very worried, really worried. I think it's been quite a shock to many of us to understand in a very profound sense how what he referred to as the potential for the melting of our institutions, how much our country, which is a country of constitutional law and legal precedent, but how much of what we hold close, the values that we hold close, are built on a consensus and not a codification of law and regulation, and how vulnerable, therefore, much of this is. And I think we're seeing how the impugning of the press, the undermining of the value and the role of the press, which was, while people may have argued with it over time, and presidents have not liked journalists for a long time, the idea that somehow they were fundamentally not part of our equation has never really had the prominence that it has now. The rollback of civil rights of many kinds, issues that were still argued over and which were maybe opposed in certain quarters, but which in many ways had been moved forward to a point of acceptance. The rise of racism, of outright bigotry on the streets of a U.S. city and several U.S. cities, again, issues that were not solved by any means, but which were not at this level. The sort of broader attacks on government accountability, on the idea that voting rights are sacred, that our electoral process is not subject to international intervention. These are things, that we had been as a country very lucky not to have as part of our everyday discussion. So we are, I've never felt more of a threat before, and I think, of course, this has implications for everyone who we share this planet with. Just to talk a bit about PEN America, the organization that I represent, we had a retreat of our trustees, our board of trustees, which includes many well-established known writers, people working a long time in human rights, people coming from other sectors America, right? We had a retreat several days after the election. It was kind of it became something like a group therapy session. We were all in shock, but we also came out of it with a real mandate and an absolute certainty that the issues at PEN America, the issues of free expression and protecting those rights that we stand for have never been more salient and more important. Our work has never been more important. And frankly, if I didn't have PEN America to wake up to every day, I'm not sure how I would be getting through this, because at least it gives us some idea, gives me some focus. And so we've worked, we have more than 5,000 members in a broader community of allies, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing just to give you an idea of what not only our organization, but other parts of civil society, which I do believe has already proven to some degree its mettle and its ability to fight back, and the jury's out on whether it will work over time, but it is an institution well established. It's a diversity of institutions well established in the U.S., which I think have some hope for holding back what's going on. So, you know, we are, as an organization, not really sure whether we can do that, whether we can succeed, whether we can make a difference, or how to make a difference. But we are searching for that, and some of what we're doing, first of all, is that we immediately, we're based in New York, but we immediately opened an office in Washington, D.C., because we do have these institutions there. They're not completely, although they are under threat, as Paul mentioned, they are not completely yet dismantled, and I think we need to work through these institutions to some degree and see what we can do. We, for example, last week filed a memo with, basically a court memo with the Supreme Court on the issue of the travel bans, and PEN America brought other arts and culture organizations together to argue against the ban on travel to the U.S. from 6 predominantly Muslim countries on the grounds that it infringed on our First Amendment rights to have personal interaction with the arts, cultures, and ideas of other countries. It's an idea that can be elaborated in legal terms, and we brought that forward to the Supreme Court. We've spent a lot of time trying to talk to Congress, to members of Congress. We've worked on the issue that Paul mentioned about the defunding of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which don't fund organizations like PEN America, but do fund many, many cultural and arts organizations around the country, especially in small cities and towns. Very important to their well-being. We've been conducting meticulous monitoring. We think it's very important that we not let things go by, that we record things, that we have something called the Trump the Truth timeline that has recorded every day the assaults on free expression, broadly understood, that have occurred, so that we can have a tab of that. That it doesn't just happen without being recorded. And we do it every day. We do a daily alert on rights and expression that monitors what's going on as it's being discussed in the media. We've also been taking on some of the very divisive and complicated issues for free expression in this environment, such as fake news, how to deal with this phenomenon of untruths and fraudulent information, while still respecting and ensuring that we don't create an answer that's worse than the problem. We've also been looking very much at the issue of hate speech, another challenging question for free expression advocates when you think about what solutions we can come up with that don't create a situation where laws and regulations intervene that can be used for pernicious reasons down the line. We've looked at, in our literary events, we've tried to make sure that we provide a platform for some of the voices that are not heard, the voices of the so-called dreamers, the young people who came to America with their parents or families illegally and are now under threat to be deported to countries that they've never been to before, and other voices which are being being suppressed in various ways, in which are being sort of marginalized. We've also tried to make sure that as an organization we don't give up on our international obligations, our advocacy for writers under threat in other parts of the world. It's been something that's been very important to us, and although we have this laser focus on what's going on in America and we are deeply preoccupied by it, we want to make sure that especially as the U.S. government becomes more muted on the questions of human rights, that at least some of us in civil society are standing up. And frankly, we are very much aware, and I'll just sort of wrap up with this, the degree to which we see the problems that we've been lucky enough not to be subjected to, but which we've worked with partners around the world, in China, in Myanmar, and in Russia, that challenges to free expression that we've seen there, have sort of landed on our doorstep. And we are very attuned to what's going on, what's happened, and thinking about this in that context. One of our board members is Masha Gessen, a Russian-American writer you may have read, and who's often come to pen congresses in the last years. And she wrote a piece right after the election, within a day or two, called "How to Survive an Autocracy," based on her own experiences. And it's been kind of our touchstone throughout the last months. And one of the things she always said was to be super alert. So that's, we do that in our monitoring. We are very attentive. She said, I always say this, I'm going to be the crazy person in the room. She said, people will tell you that you're crazy, that you're imagining this, that you really should be so concerned about it, but you should always fight against that and be very aware and very angry. We've observed things that we never thought we'd see in the White House. There are 3 generals basically running behind the scenes the White House. I mean, we were talking about a civilian government that's now that has 3 generals with very prominent, 3 current and former generals, very prominent roles, and who we're looking at to some degree. People are looking at to keep things under control. I mean, there's sort of a slight military coup has gone on. And we wonder about that. We see the question of emoluments, which is this phenomenon of personal wealth and gain from being in power, something that has never been really a phenomenon of American presidency, but is well known in many other countries. And the idea of having families in the White House, having your sons and daughters take roles of power, again, something that many of you in various countries have been more familiar with than we have, and we are very aware of that now. We've talked about media capture and the idea of media being taken over by government-aligned organizations and entities and people, sort of the line between the media and some media companies. There's also a very amazing, Paul referenced, amazing amount of fantastic journalism going on despite all this, but some companies that sort of have coming in and exercising extreme influence over many, many media markets, just with a straight line to the White House. And finally, this idea of normalization, this idea that we can't let this become the norm. We can't just accept that this thing that seemed incredible the day before is now the norm today. So we try to keep remembering. And I think these are the tools that we're going to use to fight to save our democracy and those rights of free expression that we value so much.
Thank you, Drew. Wyatt is pessimistic, and I'm going to let Larry explain why, but I will just say one thing. For the first time in my lifetime, I've seen the Joint Chiefs of Staff stand up against the president and say, no, those are not our values. We've seen the business community stand up and say, no, those are not our values. So what we're also seeing is a large section of America saying, no, these are not our values. We'll see what happens at the next ballot. But it has galvanized us to think, what are our values? So Larry?
Everything I say today, I'm not going to believe tomorrow. So everything I say today should be regarded as fake news. That's sort of I think if there's one accurate way to describe the situation of living in the United States right now, it's that you're never quite sure what you are seeing and what you're thinking and what you're believing. So, but these are my thoughts as of today on free expression in the United States. Just a couple bullet points, since I think, both Paul and Drew really covered the terrain pretty well. But, let's take freedom of the press specifically, which I think is a great concern. I think what you see is a situation where I think the institutions that we have, and particularly the First Amendment as it exists, are quite strong. In fact, the law says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press. That's that's a pretty strong bulwark. And so what you have is you'll have Trump saying early in office that he wants to change libel laws. That was one of the first things he announced. Like any good dictator, he wants to throw people in jail who insult him. And, in fact, it cannot be done by the President of the United States. Libel laws are state laws. They're not federal laws. To change libel law would require a constitutional amendment in the United States. He told his staff to go and send him a paper on how this could be done, and his staff came back and said, nah, it can't happen. And a similar thing happened when the White House, which leaks more than any administration in American history, and all administrations leak pretty badly, but this is a rotten boat, this administration. There's not a single decision that gets made in the White House that does not make it into the press within 24 hours. Trump says they're going to crack down on leakers. Every president wants to crack down on leakers. The best they can do for their proposal is come up with an idea to repeal some regulations that the Obama administration had to promulgate under pressure from the free speech community, because the Obama administration was in fact becoming so aggressive on leakers. So, Trump is certainly, I don't think, any more successful than the Obama administration in leaks. Where the Trump administration is a bit dangerous, I think, is when it says that the press is the enemy of the people. When the president becomes kind of the chief troll and cyberbully in America, and he attacks the press that way. And this is consequential. There was a new poll out just a couple weeks ago that said only two out of three Democrats believe that the news media gets its facts straight. That's Democrats. For Republicans, 14% of Republicans think the press in the United States gets its facts straight. And here's the really alarming figure. 45% of Republicans favor permitting the courts to shut down news media outlets that publish or broadcast stories that are biased and inaccurate. Think about that. 45% of Republicans would shut down a newspaper that publishes fake news. Now, again, that is not going to happen because of the First Amendment. It simply cannot happen. And the funny thing is, if it were going to happen, who are the outlets that would get shut down? InfoWars, Breitbart, and Fox News, right? But you end up with an atmosphere where the public has distrusts the press. So in point of fact, some of the best journalism in my lifetime is happening in the United States right now. The press, the mainstream media, as the right wing has been calling it for 20 years, is stronger now than it's ever been. I know reporters who are doing some of the bravest, most thorough, most solidly sourced investigative work that I've ever seen in my lifetime. But you have a significant amount of the American people who won't believe them, whatever they publish. And that's a dilemma. And that has me thinking a lot about why we believe in the First Amendment, or why we believe in freedom of expression at all. What's this supposed to be doing? I think a lot of why we feel the First Amendment is under threat in the United States is because we feel this gap between all the speech we're hearing and what we think that speech is supposed to be doing. Now, we believe in free speech, I think, for two reasons. One is because we're speaking animals, and we self-actualize through freedom of expression. That's our avenue to fulfilling our individual destiny, right? But we also have this kind of John Stuart Mill idea that free speech, free expression, is part of the clash of ideas in democratic societies that brings us closer to the truth. Well, we live in a country where we have plenty of noise, lots and lots of expression. There's no lack of free speech in the United States right now. But it's not doing that thing that we think in a democratic framework it's supposed to be doing. And I'll just give you two examples, kind of look at policy in the US. We have political debates. Well, before this administration came in, we had reached a really significant moment in the discussion about criminal justice in the United States. Both the right and the left had agreed that we incarcerate way too many people. We imprison too many people. The war on drugs is a failure. This was long a liberal position, but over the last 5 to 8 years, we had a lot of support from conservative judges in particular were the ones who said, I'm sending people to jail for 25 years because that's what I'm required to do, and that is wrong. You had the Koch brothers who are funding criminal justice reform in the United States. So we look like, had Hillary been elected, we could have reasonably expected that we would have had, by the end of her first term, possibly 1 or 2 million fewer Americans behind bars. We had reached that point. That conversation has ended completely under the Trump administration. We have an attorney general who favors the same kinds of the war on drugs, the mandatory sentencing laws. So you have a majority of people and a consensus, and yet there's not a policy getting enacted that should correct it. The same is true for health care. Once again, we have the Senate trying to repeal Obamacare. 80% of the American people now in some way favor extending Obamacare, and yet you have this thing that's happening all the time. So what's happening in what is this gap between public opinion and public discussion and policy making? There's one area, though, that I think, on a more optimistic note, this one is actually kind of a marvel. And this is because I think a lot of what you don't see outside of the United States, and even something that's hard to see in the United States, is America is not monovocal, univocal country, right? There are many, many voices in the United States. And the voices that have become more and more engaged and involved and effective and empowered in the political conversation are people who don't look like me, don't look like us. There are the communities of color in the United States. That's LGBTQ community in the United States. And these are dynamic, engaged movements in the United States that are moving a progressive agenda under the surface. Right now in the United States, there are communities all around the country that are removing civil rights monuments. This is under Trump. So I think about this a lot because we're in, Confederacy monuments to the heroes of the Civil War monuments. I'm sorry. Thank you. Civil War monuments. Now, these monuments have existed in our environment my entire life, and nobody ever talked about them. Now we have an administration that's a white nationalist administration, and it's not that the administration is saying, we want to rewrite history, get all of those statues out of here. They want those statues to stay, right? They're supporting the people who are protesting their removal. But in towns and countries across the United States, there's a conversation about the legacy of the Civil War and slavery and racism that's reached a level that I've never seen in my lifetime. And that's quite remarkable, I think. Just, I guess, a couple of more points. I think our problem with free speech may have to do with our definition, the way we describe it in the First Amendment, which is that we talk about speech. No law abridging freedom of speech. Article 19 is different, right? The Universal Declaration defines free expression as more than speech. It also defines it as listening. You have a right to seek, receive, and impart information, but imparting information, shooting your mouth off, is only 1/3 of that. The other is are you able to get the information and ideas that you need to change your mind, right? And I think one of our problems in the United States now is a listening problem. And I would identify only 2 real threats that this administration is posing to that kind of free expression, which is the crucial and necessary kind of free expression in the United States. First one is, and Drew alluded to, voter fraud investigations. There's a really serious concerted effort by the administration and the right-wing Republican Party in the United States to disenfranchise Americans from their right to vote. And this is particularly targeted at communities of color, minority communities, and poor communities in the United States, communities that they perceive as potential Democratic voters. So there is a possibly effective movement in the United States to cut a significant part of the American population out of the political conversation in its rawest and clearest form. That is, can they even cast a vote to express themselves? So that's a very big danger. And the other one is the wall, Trump's wall, which is a joke in some ways, right? He's building this wall, he's going to make Mexico pay for it, blah, 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 blah. The fact is that there's already a wall. It's not only in Mexico, but it's at every airport in the United States. It's in the consciousness of every American. It exists largely to filter out international voices and to make it harder and harder for Americans to understand the consequences of American decisions and actions overseas. Trump's wall is just kind of the physical metaphor of that American mindset, and that's serious and entrenched and getting worse. And So the possibility that Americans can actually listen to the world and incorporate the views and opinions and ideas of the rest of the world is very much up in the air right now. And if there's one thing that I think we all depend on for a safe future, it's that we in the United States are listening to the rest of you. Thank you.
We're going to open it up for just a few minutes of questions. There are microphones there and there if you want to just stand up and ask a question at the microphone. While you do that, I'll just do a quick summary. I happen to live in Washington, so I am taking home with me the image of soap suds coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. But I predict it's going to stay and be stone, but I'm going to watch it, Paul.
Please do. Please
I'll
do.
watch it. And I think Drew made the very good point that we have to be ever vigilant. And so that's the way I'll be vigilant. And I do also note, as Larry and Paul, and I think Drew too noted, that we don't have anybody in prison for what they write yet. So I believe these institutions will hold. I do have a lot of faith in the larger American public and the voice that will push back, but we do need to watch it. And we also know that for years and years, so many countries and people working on these issues have looked to the U.S. and its goals and ideals, because we were a nation formed out of an idea, not out of a collective history, but out of our ideas. And when our ideas are coming under threat, we have to see what our institutions and our population is to preserve them. So if there are any questions, raise your hand or go to a mic. Yes?
Just a few weeks ago, Facebook acknowledged that more than $100,000 were spent by so-called Russian propaganda trolls on spreading false news about Clinton campaign. And just yesterday, I actually saw in the news that Hillary Clinton now is thinking about contesting the elections. How viable you think this process can be?
I don't think that's the route that is most likely to occur, let's say, a contestation of that election. I do think the first point that you raised, the intervention in our election is something so astounding to me that, I mean, it's not just via Facebook, there are many other aspects of it. And the fact that people, that alone, I mean, this is what I think we all are reacting to, the idea that these incredible things have happened, things we could never imagine, and not one of them alone has changed the course of what's happened. I think that the issue of the Facebook, the use of the Facebook ads in that way has certainly been I mean, I think that there's a very interesting clash coming up about how to regulate social media and digital platforms that will be challenging for free expression advocates, but definitely is something that needs to be looked at, and all aspects of our elections, which in many ways are the very core of our process, even when they don't come out the way we want them to. That entire question that you raised in its many aspects, I think, is something that we all need to be very vigilant on, because that is an ultimate form of expression.
I know that the main topic at this panel is about the United States, but I would like to make you feel that you are in a good company.
Could you speak up just a little bit?
Louder?
Yeah, louder.
Okay. So if I look around in the world, I see there is not only in the United States, there is this kind of generic attitude in believing in somebody. And this somebody is the god of the situation. I look around and I see Great Britain and everything that happened with Brexit. I look around in every country, and what I see is the triumph of the little man. Everybody is entitled to his own opinion, going from the best advice for the national football team to the scientific approach to medicine, whatever. So this is a general feeling that is around all over the world. We don't need somebody who is an expert. Everybody feels entitled to an opinion that counts as much as the great one. So this kind of sociological thing is what worries me more. It's what everybody says and writes on Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth, going from small things to big ones. Why have we gone to this point?
Essentially, you're saying nobody is curating the discussion of anything. So nobody's saying what has value or not. I think we're in an age that we don't know where it's going, but we're in that age.
Well, I think this gets back to what we were talking about. It is the attack on the truth, and I think attack on science. There are facts, and 2 + 2 = 4, as I think the pen logo says. Not 2 + 2 = 5. But a lot of people are now contending that 2 + 2 = 5. Our own government in the United States is run by a party that denies global warming, and they've pulled us out of the Paris Accords. This to me seems so unimaginable. Why do these people attack science? Why are they against it? Well, it's for all these reasons you say. I think it's resentment, it's hatred of the elites, it's a feeling of powerlessness, and this generates, I think, really bad thinking. And with this kind of bad thinking perpetuating itself, it only makes the situation worse.
45th is one phenomenon, but what are you going to do with 12 million illegal immigrants right now in the US? Europe, Brexit, the rest of the world is watching very carefully what are you going to solve. This 12 million illegal immigrants and this global migration waves, who are taking care of the bottom billion? Like Paul Collier said, who is doing the nation buildings of the poor billion, bottom billion? How do you solve 12 millions in the US and the rest in Europe? Still, this migration is moving. What are you going to do?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that if you're asking, is anybody advocating for...
So, 45th is one phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
The other side of the coin is 12 million illegal immigrants. You've got to solve this. How? Who has the answer?
Well, I'll try to answer.
And then, the bottom billion, please.
I mean, solve is not, you've politicized the question by saying solve the question. One way to do it is let 12 million people who are living and working in the United States live and work in the United States. That needs no solution.
We have no problem to absorb 12 million people.
Yeah.
We have.
and you know, there are, if you've been watching the conversation about the dreamers, the youth and young children and youth who came to the United States as children and are undocumented and have had protected status thanks to Obama, that's still being extended. You'll see that there's enormous public support and advocacy on their behalf. So, you know, I think this is another area where you see a strong public consensus that's in favor for allowing these young men and women to continue their lives in the United States, and I think that extends to the larger question about immigration in general and refugee support in the U.S.
Yeah. So our hope is with consensus, as Drew pointed out, and I do think there's consensus in the U.S. for what is not happening now, and I think we'll see a change in the Paris Peace Accords. I bet we stay in them. But, you know, nothing like 4 huge hurricanes and earthquakes to get your attention that maybe something's going on. We'll see. Thank you very much. The next panel is on China. And unfortunately, we haven't left you very much time for a break, but I think there's a little time for a break between. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Marian Botsford Fraser, and I know there's an acoustic issue here, so I'm trying to find the right balance. And with me is Tien Martin Liao, who's the president of the Independent Chinese Pen Center. And we'd like to start this session with recognition of the death of Liu Xiaobo on July the 13th, 2017. Earlier this week, this poem by Liu Jia, his wife, was released. She wrote it in 2010, but it was only made public this week. Tien will read the poem first in the original Mandarin, and then I will read it in English.
黑暗之路，知道早晚有一天你会离开我，独自走黑暗之路。我祈求再现那个瞬间，看看记忆中的画面，希望画面中的我在惊恐发呆的时候，光芒绽放。可是我没有做到，只是紧紧地握住拳头，不让一点点力量从指尖流失。
The poem is called Road to Darkness, and it's been translated from Mandarin by Ming Di. Sooner or later, you will leave me, one day, and take the road to darkness alone. I pray for the moment to reappear so I can see it better, as if from memory. I wish that I, astonished, could glow, my body in full bloom of light for you. But I couldn't have made it, except clenching my fists, not letting the strength, not even a little bit of it, slip through my fingers. I'm just going to ask you to stand for a minute of silence for Liu Xiaobo. As you can see, this is a conversation, it's not a panel. And it is a time when we can reflect on Liu Xiaobo, his importance, both to us in the pen community and what he stood for in terms of the search by China, the citizens of China for democracy, for the kinds of rights that are actually given to them in their own constitution. Before we start our conversation, I just want to draw your attention to the empty chair. If you're not a PEN member, you might not know about the empty chair. It's a tradition in PEN to always recognize the writer who cannot be with us in the room, to acknowledge that we are free to be here and to converse and to understand, but there are people who cannot be here because they are in prison. And the empty chair for this session is Liu Jia, who is Liu Xiaobo's wife. She was placed under unofficial house arrest without charge or legal due process immediately following the October 2010 announcement that Liu Xiaobo would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Her home was guarded by security officers. She was prevented from communicating freely with the outside world. While under house arrest, Liu Xia's physical and mental health deteriorated considerably. Since the death of her husband, it seems that there are still restrictions that have been placed upon her. And Tien can talk about that in a minute. At the time of his death, Liu Xiaobo was receiving treatment for late-stage liver cancer, for which he received a diagnosis in May. He was on medical parole while serving an 11-year sentence for inciting subversion of state powers in connection with his involvement of drafting of Charter 08, which was a call for the protection of human rights and democratic reform in China. During his incarceration, the couple was only permitted to see one another once a month. Liu Xiaobo's ashes were scattered at sea on the 15th of July in a move condemned by Chinese dissidents as an attempt to avoid the creation of a site of pilgrimage. Liu Xia appears in photographs of the ceremony disseminated by Chinese authorities, but she's not been seen since, despite assertions from government spokespersons that, quote, Liu Xia is currently free but wishes to be alone. And PEN International remains extremely concerned for her physical and psychological well-being. And perhaps, Tien, the first thing I could ask you to tell us is where you think Liu Xia is now and, you know, what you imagine her current state of mind to be.
Thank you, Marian. As you mentioned, Liu Xia's stand under house arrest at the moment when it was announced that Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize Award. That was October 2010, when Frankfurt Book Fair started. Before that, I could sometimes talk to Liu Xia on the phone, and even later, at the same year, I edited a book of Liu Xiaobo, which is later, first it was published in German and later in almost 10 different languages. And at that time, I can talk to Liu Xia and ask about the copyrights issues. And we can even exchange emails. But from that deadline, she was actually she lived under total isolation, no phone, no access to internet. She cannot leave the house. She cannot visit any friends or relatives. Nobody can come even close to the building where she lives. And I think 3 years later, that was I believe that was January 2014. This total isolation has been lifted. She has limited freedom. She can visit her parents and her brother and sometimes even meet with friends. But that was also only for the limited time till June this year. In June this year, the authority released Liu Xiaobo from prison because he was terminally ill and he has got liver cancer. From that point on, all the contact which Liu Xia had with the outside world has been cut off too. 2 months before, that was April or March or April, I even talked to her or even see her on my cell phone. We have a software so we can see each other and talk to each other. She was quite well, and she didn't even know that her husband was that ill. All right, and then since June this year, we know nothing about her. Of course, through media and through other methods, we know that after Liu Xiaobo's death on 13th of July, she was again under house arrest, but not house arrest. No, she has been taken away, and we know that she has been sent to Yunnan province. That's in south. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got the information that she has been sent back to Beijing, but not to her own apartment. She actually is now in a hospital in Beijing. just as Mary mentioned, she has done nothing. Well, she has written some point, but that not even that was a crime in China under this Xi Jinping administration. She's just a wife of Liu Xiaobo, and she has to suffer all this, all the ways, all the years, and we still don't know what will happen. And some absurd situation I can tell you later. But we still have to wait till the 19th party Congress of the Communist Party is over. That will be on October 18th, and it takes about 1 week. After that, it is possible that the government will negotiate with her, whether she can have some limited freedom again, or whether she can leave the country. Because Liu Xia's will is to leave the country, and his first choice is to come to Germany. She has a very good friend, Liao Yiwu. He lives in Berlin, and she wishes to come to Berlin, to Germany. And that was also Liu Xiaobo's last wish. As you all know, when he was lying on the deathbed, he wanted to leave the country together with Liu Xia and her brother. So that's the situation at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about Liu Xiaobo as a person. I know that you have edited his words, and you know his words very well. Did you know him personally? Did you meet him?
I know him. I can say I know him very well, although I have never met with him person to person, because China is a lost land for me. I cannot enter that country since over 20 years, since the massacre. But I was grown up in Taiwan. But that's not the issue. I cannot go to China since 20 years or 25 years, and Liu Xiaobo cannot leave the country. But I was in Washington, D.C. I worked 10 years there, and we have a website, Observe China. And Liu Xiaobo was in our author pool. He writes regularly for us, once in a month, once in a week. He writes really, really good analytical articles, always to the very current situation about the workers' situation, about the new digital era, about election on the countryside, and so on. So I know him very well. He just write his article and call me on Skype and send the article to me, and I read it. If I have questions, we will discuss then. That happens every other day, so sometimes we just chat on Skype, and I can hear that Liu Xia is on the background, and she bring her sometimes a soup, or I can hear that that Liu Xiaobo, he's a heavy smoker. He just, I can hear that and can feel that. I said, you are a heavy smoker. And then he just, by talking, he just eat his soup. and so on. So I feel that we are very close. And it's really, I can say that we are close because I read most of his text. I can only say most of his text because he has published 11 books. Not blah blah, but really, really good philosophical and literary books and social critical things. And between 2000, he was released from the labor camp 1999. From 2000 till his arrest, he has written almost 1,000 articles and was very, very critical. He has written one book, I remember, that was published in 1984. And that's the title is The Chinese Intellectuals and the China Politics. So in that book, a very thin book, maybe 100 pages, he really take the tradition and the culture and the Chinese philosophy to the focused on that topic and raise his very critical voices. And it brings him a fame. He was called the Black Horse Liu Xiaobo. And the professors in Beijing Normal University, that's where he has made his dissertation. The old professors, 7, 8, when he was, how do you say, defending his dissertation, the old professor with gray hair sitting on the stage and just hear this young man just protect his thesis. And it was a sensation in the whole campus. It's a wonderful thing. So he was a very wise man at that time.
He was sentenced for subversion of the state power. And it's interesting that the verdict, it offered as evidence only 7 phrases that he had written between 2005 until he was detained. And these 7 sentences amount to something like 244 characters of Chinese text, apparently, the ones that were actually in the verdict against him. But in none of these phrases did he call for the overthrow of the government. He didn't offer a critique of he merely expressed opinion. So how radical was Charter 08 in terms of what it was asking from the Chinese government? Why was it considered so radical?
May I just make a small correction, Marian? Excuse me. In the verdict, he has been accused because of 6 articles.
6 articles.
6 articles, and his co-draft of this. Closer. His crime was, they named 6 articles, and 2 we have published on our website, and his co-draft of this so-called Charter 08. And now you ask, why is it a crime? Why does the government think it's so unforgivable? But I think you know, all of us know, the essence, the real character of a dictatorship is the fear of a dictator, the fear of the ruler, the fear of the ruler, of the power, of the powerless, of the people. And especially, they are afraid of people who are clear in their mind. Well, if you allow me to say the intellectuals, they hate if the students, the professors, they go together with workers and with normal people. That's they are really afraid of. And the Charter 08, which you mentioned, is a very mild document. In the preface, it says why they, that's Liu Xiaobo and his friend Zhang Zuhua, why these 2 draft this, this document. It's 70 years French Revolution. It's the 80 years of, 70 years of the May 4th movement. That's 1919 in China. And it's 200-year French Revolution and so on. To this certain date, they want to make this document. It is more or less a little bit a copy of the Charter 77. And then it makes a short definition of different things: freedom, democracy, human rights, civil rights, and so on. And then 19 suggestions. What should happen in field of education? What should happen in this miserable agriculture policy? What should happen to the workers who lost their jobs, and so on? So it is such a mild document, no reason. But you know that the government, if they want to put someone into jail, they don't have to have any reason. Maybe I can name one name here. The Uyghur professor, Ilham Tohti, has been sentenced to life. He is in jail since 2 or 3 years. He has also drafted very soft articles, asked the autonomy in Uyghur area, and he got life sentence. So the reason is the dictatorship is always afraid of the power of knowledge, the power of ration.
In the years since he wrote Charter 08 and was, first of all, he was imprisoned for almost a year without any charges, and then he was finally charged and sentenced to 11 years. Can you just reflect a little bit on what happened after Liu Xiaobo went to prison? There was the additional insult, of course, of the Nobel Peace Prize. But what is your sense of the period from that time forward to now in terms of the freedom of expression challenges? I know that there were immediately after, I think after his sentence was announced, there were very quickly, swiftly crackdowns and arrests. How has that changed over the past 10 years?
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost 10 years.
What's your sense of that 10-year period? Because, of course, that period ends with his death. So I'm just wondering how you see this last decade in terms of the challenges of freedom of expression in China.
May I first go a little bit personal and then answer this question? Well, December 10th, no, yes, December 10th, no, is it December 10th? No, December 10th is the day of human rights. The Nobel Peace Prize, which should hand it to him, that was December 8th, 2010. So, as you know, you also mentioned the empty chair. Liu Xiaobo was the laureate. He should come. Of course, he was not. He was in prison. And his wife, his family, or her family, no friends, no relatives, no one from China could leave that country in those days. So other people are going to Oslo who have nothing to do with that, including me. Well, anyway, I was in Oslo. I stand there, I participate in the ceremony. I see on the stage, this beautiful stage, and how do you say, emperor? No, the king and the queen, they sit in front there, and they put an empty chair, and the committee member sits there, and there's an empty chair, and they put the document for Liu Xiaobo there. So that was the empty chair. And later on, we have a wonderful, really royal style of dinner in a hall. I had the honor to be there, and there was again the king and the queen, and everything is glittering. And so I was thinking, Liu Xiaobo, where is he? He is in jail today. What is he eating? We are eating this wonderful meal, but what is he eating? Maybe he has a soup with some leaves of vegetables. Maybe he's allowed to eat more rice as usual. That's what happened to the Nobel Prize laureate. Exactly that day. And we have nothing to do with this honor. We are sitting there, and he was in jail in a small room, 3 to 4 meters, shared with another 4 white guys, normal criminals. That was what happened. I'm sorry, just put this episode into it. And you ask, what happened in these past 9-10 years in terms of human rights? Well, actually, we are complaining all the time because there is really no freedom of expression, no freedom, no press freedom. But I never could imagine that the situation is even getting worse and worse, especially when the President Xi Jinping, he take over the power 5 years ago. Everybody thought, well, this guy, he has been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, and his father was a very high politician. They all suffered very much. If someone has suffered, and he will learn something, he know how the normal people are living, and he know in a bad time that you can go to jail or you can lose your life just because you have written one piece of paper. Or every day is a portrait of Mao Zedong on the newspaper. And China was very poor at that time in the 60s. If you wrap something, if you wrap your dirty shoes with a newspaper, and it happened to be the portrait of Mao, somebody can accuse you, you can lose your life. That was such a terrible time. Mm-hmm. And we thought Xi Jinping, he should learn something. He has experienced this terroristic time, but no, he is even worse. The situation of freedom of expression is getting worse and worse. We have tens and dozens of writers, journalists, lawyers being put into jail in the past 5 years. And the tendency is still going up. So what press of freedom, in terms of press of freedom and expression, is deteriorating. I don't mean the other things. Economically, China is turning to become a world power, unfortunately.
What is your sense of the role of PEN going forward now that Liu Xiaobo has died? We know that there are still a number of your members still in prison in China. So, how do you think we take this closure of that chapter, this tragic closure of that chapter, the way that the Chinese government dealt with the end of his life, the fact that they did not, apparently were terrified to allow him to leave the country. So how do we read that in terms of what we should do going forward?
Thankful for all what you have done in the past years. I know you don't know Liu Xiaobo, but I know him. But you have done so much. We tried very hard, especially in the last 2.5 weeks, when we noticed that he was dying. So, of course, we have written letters we sent letters to Chancellor Merkel. We written letters to different institutions, and we have also, through private channel, we have really contact to the Chancellor office. I did have a illusion that maybe a miracle could happen. Especially the last couple of days, they sent a German doctor and an American doctor to visit him in the hospital. but it always proves that we, and me, we are too naive. This regime will never let Liu Xiaobo come out of the jail, living come out of the jail. If you think there are many other personalities like Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, even Aung San Suu Kyi, they have this high honor, and later, if the situation changes, they become the leader. I don't say that I have this illusion. I know Liu Xiaobo, he is not a politician, but he is a person. He's a person with charisma. He can attract people. I said that he was very wild when he was young, but later, through the 90s, especially after the massacre on Tiananmen Square, and in the 90s, he becomes really mature, not only in his mind, but also in his attitude. So he can, in his final statement, he said, I have no enemies and I have no hatred. It is really out of his belief. It's not just a slogan or empty words. It's not. I really understand that. But all these words, it's just, you throw these words to a stone wall, it bounces back. Mm-hmm. So it's, we had a conference in Malmö at the end of August. It was dedicated to Liu Xiaobo. And we invited also the Nobel Peace Prize laureate from 2003, Shirin Ebadi. She's an Iranian lawyer and a writer. And she said to us, Liu Xiaobo said, I have no enemies, I have no hatred. She said, she is a woman with full temperament. She said, I have enemies, I have hatred. Actually, I thought that all the time. Liu Xiaobo said he has no enemies, no hatred. But the government and the Chinese government, with all its army, with its soldier, with the police forces in the hand, they are still afraid of this man. They treat him as their enemy. They bring him to his death. And they are continuing to do this to many of my colleagues. So I don't know what we still can do, but I think, according to our former experience, it's always also your experience because you have helped a lot of Chinese writers. Remember Ye Du. Mm-hmm. Writers who have been in jail, when they come out, they tell us, someday suddenly the whole situation in jail becomes pleasant, they become enough food to eat and so on. Later on they find out, because in the outside world, in Western world, somebody has written an article or made protest or written letters to their government. And all this information reached the Chinese side, reached the Chinese authority and even the prison. So if we continue, for instance, we can write a letter to Liu Xia. She will not receive it in her hand, but the Chinese authority, even the highest level, they will see it. And they know Liu Xia is not forgotten. And I think all the effort, even very tiny effort, has its effect. I hope I'm not too naive. I believe every effort will help. Maybe not save lives, but help the people to have a little bit better life, even in prison.
We're going to end with a couple of short poems by Liu Xiaobo, and then if we have time for a couple of questions, I'm not sure if we will, but we'd just like to finish this kind of sense of really all of PEN is mourning the death of Liu Xiaobo. This is a poem that he wrote for Jia. It's called Morning. Between the gray walls and a burst of chopping sounds, morning comes, bundled and sliced, and vanishes with the paralyzed souls of the chopped vegetables. Light and darkness pass through my pupils. How do I know the difference? Sitting in the rust, I can't tell if it's the shine on the shackles in the jail or the natural light of nature from outside the walls. Daylight betrays everything. The splendid sun, stunned. Morning stretches and stretches in vain. You are far away, but not too far to collect the love of my night.
To the end, I would like to cite several sentences also from Liu Xiaobo. He has written this poem in 1996 when he was sentenced to 3 years labor camp, and he has written these poems for his wife. The title is What One Can Bear for My Suffering Wife. It's a little bit longer, but I just cite several sentences. You said to me, I can bear anything. With stubborn eyes, you faced the sun until blindness became a ball of flame, and the flame turned the sea to salt. Beloved, let me ask you through the dark before you go to your grave. Remember to write me a letter with your ashes. Remember to leave me your address in the netherworld. It continues. Well, now we know that they are finally separated and live in different worlds. We are here, Liu Xiang are here, and Liu Xiaobo is somewhere else.
So thanks a lot. I would like to start with saying that the Free Word Association is just a recent association recently created in Russia. And in it, there participate people who work on a professional level with the Russian language. That's why we have included the word "word" into the very title of the organization, since we are writers, bloggers, reporters, publishing, translators, interpreters, and word is of importance for all of us. A lot of us, over the recent years, have been members of the Russian Pen Center, but unfortunately, the situation is that over 80 people over the last year were forced to leave Russian Pen Center, which unfortunately has stopped being human rights organization and has fully suspended this direction of activity, which is a great problem, which unfortunately is familiar for us in Russia as far as civil society organizations are concerned, since a lot of organizations have decided to terminate their human rights activity in the conditions we currently have in Russia. But nevertheless, we have this Free Word Association, which has as its largest project the preparation of this report on the state of arts in the freedom of speech, on the freedom of artistic expression in Russia. And we tried to unite the effort of many reputable and highly professional and knowledgeable experts in the field. These are human rights activists and these are civil society organizations. Their Memorial Human Rights Center, which is a highly reputable organization working in Russia for many years, has been working at this report. Also, the Fund of Glasnost Protection was dealing with the preparation of this report, since they studied the situation with the freedom of speech. And we also had the Golos Association and the Over the Info organization, which monitors the situation with compliance with human rights and violation of human rights on behalf of different law enforcement authorities. So it seems to me that we have managed to collect a small congress of human rights and civil society organizations, and by joint effort we managed to create this report, which further on was taken by the International PEN Club, PEN International, which treats it very professionally, very seriously, and PEN International has helped us to bring the report to the standard which is more acceptable for this type of reports in the world, and we also worked at the translation of this report. So we may claim today that this is the work done by joint effort of us, of PEN International, and of all the organizations involved in the preparation of the report. I will take the most important elements and constituent elements of this report. Primarily, this is going to be the overall situation in Russia. You know, I have a recent piece of news from yesterday, and it was yesterday that I sent this report by email, though this report has been introduced only today, but I sent it yesterday to Washington to my friends for them to see it. These are my friends and my colleagues from a reputable think tank in America dealing with human rights and policy, and I got a letter from them that this is a perfect report, thanks a lot, and you don't even imagine who will use it primarily. It will be used by many Russian citizens who are now in different countries of the world and who are asking for political asylum in different countries of the world, because each of them now faces a technical task. In their dossier, in their personal files, they need to show a certain document which would clearly describe the situation in Russia. And this is the basic of any legal work connected with asking for political asylum, and your report in this sense is going to be of great use for them. It really seems to me that this report explains in a very bright and clear way the general situation in Russia. The situation in which a lot of Ukrainian writers and Ukrainian human rights activists have been involved. These are the producers, these are theater actors, these are writers, the playwrights, those publishing books for children, also the people who disseminate the books, also who offer them in libraries. So all these people have got into the situation which is described by one old Russian saying that if we destroyed cockroaches, it's actually impossible, but you can try and make their life unbearable. That's the structure of the official, or rather unofficial, doctrine of the Russian Federation at the moment, that they're trying to make their lives impossible. Yes, we have the guarantees of human rights enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, and we have the guarantees for freedom of conscience, conscience of speech, conscience of assembly, and a lot of other freedoms, but these freedoms were also available in the Constitution of the 50s, of Stalin, and in the Brezhnev's period Constitution of the 60s, and they are available in the current Constitution. But practice shows us that now we have to state that we are facing the consistent attack of the Russian Federation against the field of information, against journalism, against literature, and generally against art. I may tell you that this is being done using many indirect tools, indirect mechanisms, or mechanisms of indirect effect. You know, it's not mandatory to nationalize some editorial board or certain newspaper or a certain TV channel to start controlling it. It's enough to place it into unbearable legal and economic conditions. And this is assisted by the great number of legislative acts passed recently in the Russian Federation. Many of them have rather neutral headlines, not neutral titles, and their aims and tasks seem to be very noble and generalist, like protection of state sovereignty or fighting against international terrorism, fighting against extremism of different types, protection of children against unbearable or undesirable effect, and so on and so forth. But these slogans actually hide away from us the laws in line with which law enforcement agencies in the Russian Federation can go deeper and deeper into their public life, into creativity, and into the field of freedom of speech. The brightest example is the so-called Yarovaya law. There is a deputy, Yarovaya, in the Russian parliament, and this Mrs. Yarovaya became the formal official initiator of the law. So we know that this law, or in fact even the package of the laws, was compiled by the presidential administration in the Russian Federation, which means in the Kremlin. But that's the way our system works, that the parliament is kind of a technical cliche which cannot take any independent legislative actions. They just get it from the Kremlin and they have to perform it. So the parliament is a rubber stamp. So this Yarovaya law is actually meant to fight against terrorism, but the law has certain consequences in that any information which goes along the electronic systems of the Russian Federation, including private telephone communications, any text messages, electronic mails, or the content of different internet sites. So this all needs to be planned and stored on huge servers, and it should be at the disposal of Russian security services without any court decisions. There is another law, the law which aims to protect the Russian children and other vulnerable strata of the society in the Russian Federation against the negative effect of different extremists and the Russian speaking part of the internet. On the basis of this law, a blacklist was compiled. This list is known to the special agency, Roskomnadzor, which is the Russian agency for supervision over mass communications. And over the recent year, into this list there have been included over 900 internet sites. So they are prohibited, they are banned. And you know, for many years internet was developing, and this process started in the middle of the 90s, and we lived with the feeling that internet is inseparable. We cannot, this is the thing where everything is connected with everything. That is a global web which controls the whole world, and it cannot be controlled itself. But it turned out that the methods of controlling over the internet are really impossible, but over access to the internet are possible. And here a weak spot is the companies providers which provide the Russian citizens with access to the internet. It was done with no interference of courts, but just by means of pressuring them, they were forced to close access of the Russian citizens to some parts of social media. And if you take your smartphones even now and have a look at one of those 900 sites which are on this blacklist, you will be frustrated because, well, there is no problem, the site is there, it works, you can see it, you can read it, everything is alright. But that's because you are beyond the territory of Russia. And the only moment you cross the border on Russia, you start using the Russian provider allowing you access to the site, so you won't get any access to this site. So here is the second situation, which stands for mass closure of internet sites. A great number of special measures are taken to make offliners work, traditional mass media, more complicated, including book publishing houses, including editorial boards of newspapers and TV companies. Again, the pretexts are rather generous and noble. Let's say it may sound as, let's restrict the right of foreign citizens to own businesses in the Russian Federation. And this shows that commercial newspapers or commercial TV stations are deprived from access to investment in this way, because international media business turns out to be deprived of the possibility to invest into the Russian press. And there are plenty of such situations, really a lot. And in some cases, they are related to specific individuals, and some refer to groups. You will have a chance to have a look at the report because it's categorized and classified by different directions, but I guess that of importance several personal case studies which show you the general tactics of making your life impossible, making the life of the people who are trying to still preserve the right to freedom of speech in Russia unbearable. I think that those staying in Ukraine know the name of Oleg Sentsov, who is a well-known person in Ukraine, a well-known author of stories and movie plots and poems. This is the person who is rather popular and well-known here, and he has been sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment in strict conditions in the Russian camps for the intention to subvert state activity and to have a terrorist act on the territory of Crimea, which was not proven because he didn't do anything he could be accused of. He just had the intention, as it is considered by the Russian prosecutor. But there is also the example which is a little bit less known, although it's also very bearable, very terrible. In Moscow, there was closed the Library of Ukrainian Literature. That was the state institution funded by the state, and it had functioned for many years. But its director, Natalia Shaigo, a woman who for many decades ruled this library, managed this library, was not a revolutionary. She was an ordinary clerk. She was never a civil society activist. She didn't have to do anything with the politics. She was just a clerk there, and she spent 19 months under home arrest. And currently she is in court, and probably in the nearest days we will have sentences passed in her cases because she was accused of keeping extremist Ukrainian literature in the premises of this library. I think that this is a very bright example, a bright case showing that this may refer to anybody, to those people who are active in terms of their civil society standpoint and fight, and it refers also to people who are just doing their modest business. And if you have anything to do with the freedom of speech in Russia today, for you, that is a great life risk which demands great bravery and courage from you. Thanks a lot. So, those couple of words I'm going to tell about the Russian censorship is not a report and not an extract of any serious report. This is more of a writer's view of what is happening at the moment in this sense in Russia, because I'm really primarily a writer and a journalist. To put it in general words, I may tell you that in my writer's activity I never faced the cases of direct censorship, which means that never ever, and you know, in Russia I have published already 9 novels, never ever did my publisher ask me to remove a certain section or chapter from my text. And the same happens to the writers with whom I speak rather a lot on the topic and with whom I have had meetings at different book fairs. But that does not mean that censorship does not exist. Sergey Parkhomenko has just told us that it always seemed to us that it's impossible to introduce censorship on the internet. And up till recently, a lot of writers thought that the only problem of absence or availability of censorship is whether you're going to be published or not. this is the point of the publishing house, because the publishing house can either refuse to publish your book if it thinks that it is dangerous, or it may agree to publish you, undertaking the risk in a certain sense. In fact, over the recent, I guess, 4 or 5 years, I've been permanently seeing one and the same process. Among writers, there have started appearing internal fear, and there has started appearing something we could call self-censorship. It seems that writers do not depend on the state. It seems that writers, I mean the writers who are published, whose works are published on a more or less regular basis in large circulations. So the writers seemingly don't need the money to write a novel or to write a short story. To sit and to write, I need just a computer, I need my brains, and no other means are necessary. I don't need anything from the state or from any non-state foundation for that. But, you know, in private talks between the writers, I started hearing more and more often the talks about fear. They say, I'm afraid of what I've written. Moreover, I must confess you, though being ashamed of this, that over the recent period, I've also been having this sense of genetic fear. This does not mean I'm not fighting against it. I'm really doing this, but I feel it. In my recent novel, I published, actually I did it half a year ago, and the novel is entitled Sinologist. I speak about the image of modern Russia, which consists of the way it is described in the novel of the Nazi and Soviet practices. The novel is written as the anti-utopian novel, and when I was writing it, and I was doing this over 3 years, many times I had two feelings: whether I'm moderate enough in my words, and whether the publisher will agree to publish this. Never ever did I allow myself to deviate from what I consider to be right. And when I brought this novel to the publishing house was contemplating for several months whether to publish it or not. So normally my novels are accepted by the publishing house at once, and they conclude the agreement even before the novel is completed. Nevertheless, I'm very grateful to the publishing house for publishing my novel. I have meetings with readers, and only over the last 3 to 4 years I've been hearing one and the same question: how did you dare write a thing like this? Don't you have fear? Aren't you afraid? And how does the publishing house dare publish your novel? Which means that the society again has this Soviet-type fear. Soviet-type fear on which everything was built in the Soviet regime. That was this all-power nature of the Soviet regime. And that was based on that. The situation now is different, and I like the comparison I have heard from one of the reporters, and which then I heard rather often. But I don't know, maybe some of you have not heard it. The situation in Russia, and in particular with censorship, is like the situation when you are driving a car, because we are almost all drivers, and we know that to the left from us there are 2 integral lines, and we do know that those lines, those stripes, cannot be crossed. So the situation in current Russia, in particular in the aspect of censorship, is as follows. All those who write, all those who read, all those who control and supervise us know that those two lines exist. But nobody knows where they are now. And every day, taking your seat at your desk, you have to, or rather I have to switch off this option in my brain. I need to live in the way as if I believe that there are no two lines, no two stripes like this. So far I managed to do this. And the same goes about many other writers who are my colleagues, fortunately. I don't know what's going to happen further on, but it is so far. And also, everybody knows that there is a great and most serious censure on TV and in mass media. The fact that this type of censorship does not exist in literature does not yet mean that the authorities are respectful in their treatment of writers in literature. This just means, unfortunately, that the authorities have a contempt for those who are writers and who are readers. The authorities consider that the majority of residents won't read serious literature, but they will just have the things shown on TV. That will be enough for them. And I hope very much that this epoch will be over soon. So first of all, I would like to remind you that at this desk we don't have one person who is very important for us, and this person has been with us since the beginning of our work. This is Svetlana Alexeyevich, who did a lot for the freedom of speech to become a reality. The report, which has been introduced today by Sergey, is the result of the work of many people, and this is the first report which shows in a comprehensive way the general situation with violations of freedom of speech and freedom of creativity, not only in literature, and not only in journalism, and not only on the internet, but also in theaters, in the publishing business, in education and libraries. This is the field where we live. We live in the world of words. 26 years ago, when in Moscow, in Russia, people started advocating their young democracy, everybody thought that truth will bring us to better life. This is what Sergey remembers, this is what Svetlana remembers, and a lot of people remember this. We were younger and we really trusted in that. And for a long period of time, people really believed that, well, a lot of things were a failure, but still freedom of speech is what really have got. And over the last years in Russia, though people are trying to forget about this, but this year, since we celebrate the 26th anniversary of the August days, no official TV channel said any single official word of this. So we're trying to become convinced that this thing did not happen, which is a very dangerous symptom, which should be estimated. What is the report like? This report, in fact, represents the situation in which our co-citizens live. And here I would like to object to Sergey's words, because I think that it will be most necessary for the Russian journalists and for the Russian writers and for the Russian students and young people who would keep on living in Russia and who would be willing to see their country as the country of the freedom of speech. 26 years ago, when we were ready to sacrifice almost our lives for the sake of freedom, nobody could even think that in 25 years in the country where the censorship is banned by the law, the list of perished journalists will be longer than 350 surnames, and the majority of those cases will be without impunity. Will be with impunity. And as far as bloggers are concerned who can express their ideas in a free way, those results, those statements of bloggers have become a common thing in our country. Well, our report shows that every week bloggers, writers, artists are subject to attacks, physical abuse, court prosecutions which are ungrounded, and threats. Threats, including online threats, which is a new problem. In particular, it is related to females, because the attacks against women are 3 times more frequent than against men. These are also threats of sexual harassment or the threat of attacks against your relatives. And quite recently, Elena, who is a great novelist and writing in Roman languages, and who is broadcaster, had to leave the country. She was forced to do this because there were some threats made to her life. So far, the investigation is not showing any good results. Elena Lilash and Elena Kostychenko, who are also reporters, regularly get threats of attacks on them, and nobody acts in this respect. This culture of impunity is the culture which unfortunately exists in the Russian Federation, but which needs to be stopped. Why does it all exist? Unfortunately, as Sergey has already mentioned, a lot of organizations which are cultural, creative, and organizations, civil society organizations, have stopped their human rights activity. They prefer dealing with some social issues, social plots. And many people think, unfortunately, that this is not their business to protect the rights of writers and the rights of reporters. That is a separate matter. I think that this report will contribute to people's not only knowing about the things going on, but for their being able to consolidate the effort and to together win over this evil and this culture of impunity, and win the fundamentalism, which you can also read about in the report. And on behalf of all the colleagues who participated in this work, and on behalf of those who know that the report is here, that the report has been published with the support of PAN International, I would be willing to express the words of gratitude and hope, because many writers, many journalists suffer suffer in this country, in Russia, from isolation. They feel alone, but a lot of people think that truth and justice will win one day. But this feeling of having something to do with the general movement is a great feeling, and this is salvation against separation and staying alone. Thank you. I think this is what we can do.
As a foreigner, reporting on Russia, Russia's activities from without the country and from within the country. So I want to talk about 2 things. Now, the first thing is censorship as propaganda. And this is very important because this is something Russia does externally. And if you look at what I have been covering, it is Russian aggression, specifically in the Ukraine. So that's the first thing. It is censorship as propaganda. The second thing is the way that Russian censorship now works, which has been touched upon. Now, these 2 strands are, in my opinion, they converge in the figure of Vladimir Putin, who I describe in my book and elsewhere as probably the world's first postmodern dictator. Now, I first encountered sort of the way that Russia censors the press through the form of social media attacks against me online when I was covering Ukraine. Now, one may not think of this as censorship in the traditional sense, in that you are not being stopped from, I was not stopped, no Russian authority was stopping me from writing. However, given that social media has become the preeminent source from which young people get their news, the goal was, in essence, to censor and suppress what was happening, what I was reporting coming out of Ukraine. And it is a very unique and it is a very clever form of censorship. My colleague rightly said when the internet came, there was this belief, which the author Yevgeny Morozov has called cyber-utopianism, that the world would be interconnected, we would all be globally networked, borders would count for little, there would be a great coming together of humanity. Now, it is true that, the internet is inherently transnational. We are connected. However, cyber utopians fail to take into account that, just as, networks could, be used to help people during Maidan, during Tahrir Square in Egypt, that the same tools could become to be used by oppressive states. And nobody has harnessed the power of the internet greater and with more skill than Russia. Now, what I found when I was reporting Ukraine, and I was in the country for 9 months during 2014, visiting Donetsk, Luhansk, Sloviansk, Debaltseve, throughout the ATO zone from the very beginning, is that I and fellow journalists were subjected to a consistent and organized trolling effort. Every article we published was jumped upon by trolls, was discredited, and what made this so interesting, what made this form of effective censorship was so interesting, and what made it different from traditional propaganda, is that it never tried to promulgate a particular narrative. There was never a clear narrative, no, Russia is good. This was never the point. The point was always to spread so many narratives, to spread so many conflicting stories, that nobody knew what was going on. And this is the utter heart, and it is the heart of people like Donald Trump. The goal is not like the propaganda of old to twist the truth. The point is to get to a stage where you subvert the very notion of an objective truth at all. Because if you can get people to disbelieve certain amounts, to erode sources in all sources of information, then they can believe anything. And this eventually leads us to Donald Trump saying, we go from Bill Clinton, to look at it at a global level, Bill Clinton, I did not have sex with that woman, a lie, to Donald Trump saying, my crowds were bigger than Obama's, when you can see that they're not. So I think that this is a very important way in which Russia censors people. And you saw this classically in the downing of MH17 in July 2014. Now, I was in Ukraine when that happened. And the flood of disinformation was unbelievable. The Ukrainians did it. The Americans did it. The Ukrainians and the Americans did it. People thought it was Putin's plane. The point was not. It was just to confuse everybody. And in the midst of it all, I saw people trying to make sense of it, readers, and they couldn't do it. And they had what is essentially a very straightforward situation of Russian separatists shooting down a plane. Strelkov posted on his Vkontakte thing, the post was then read, but it was a very straightforward thing. But it was only 2 years later, until the report was made, that, which Russia still denies, that there was any sense of clarity. So I think that is a very, very important point to make, is that censorship is coming in new forms. It is coming in forms that do not look like censorship. And the internet has created this. It has given a space to every voice. And it has given a space to every conspiratorial theory to find like-minded people with conspiratorial theories. And it has given a space for the truth to invert Churchill's quote, to be surrounded by a quartet of lies wherever it goes. And I think this is at the heart, which is coming on to my second point, of the way Russian censorship works. And by censorship, I describe it as to suppress the truth, especially to suppress the truth in the aim of a political goal, which is exactly what Russia was doing throughout the Ukraine crisis, what it still does during the Ukraine crisis, but at its height, it was something to behold. It's something I've never seen before in commenting in various war zones I've been. The second point is about how do you internally suppress dissent? And this is where, again, Putin, I call him a postmodern dictator. Yanukovych was a modern dictator. The people came into the streets and he started shooting them. And that was it. He was finished. If you kill people now, en masse now, then you become Bashar al-Assad and you're pariah. Or you become Kim Jong-un and you have to wall yourself up from the world. This is not options available to Russia. Russia needs to be in the global economy. So what do? And it's exactly as my colleague here says. You replace the gulag with zoning violations to shut down a newspaper. You replace the firing squad with tax bills for newspapers. You know, what you don't do is you don't overtly, en masse, go around killing people. And this is what, when he was talking about the law, Sergey, absolutely right. You dress this up in the language of human rights, you coat it in the veneer of democracy, and this is what the postmodern dictator is. He uses the language, the tools of democracy in order to further dictatorial ends. And this is the future of democracy, of despotic states. Saddam Hussein, Idi Amin, all these people, they're passé. You know, they're gone. If you want to be like them, as I said, you will be Assad. Russia, censorship is coated in the language of human rights, as I said, child protection, protection of sovereignty. No more gulags. Oh, I'm sorry, sir, your taxes, you fiddled your taxes, we will shut you down. This is how censorship, when I was in Russia, I found work. These were the greatest problems people were facing. But externally, please understand and please be aware that censorship now has taken on a new form, and that form is very much a proactive form of propaganda. And at the notion of that is the question of truth, and it is hugely successful. There's a story, and I like to equate Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in one sense. I'm not going to equate them totally. I mean, Donald Trump is still the leader of a democracy. You know, Donald Trump hasn't had journalists killed, hasn't had opposition figures killed. But in one sense, they are the postmodern politician. And I will repeat it again. Their goal is not to twist the truth like the politicians of old. It is to subvert the very notion that there is an objective truth at all. There's a story, and I will end on this story because I think I've talked for a fair amount of time, where at his house, his villa in Mar-a-Lago, where Trump takes the great and the good that come to visit him, Trump tells everybody that visits him, these tiles were hand-painted by Walt Disney. And eventually his butler, you know, Trump obviously has a butler being Trump, a real Trump loyalist, you know, a loyalist to Trump. He told the story and he said to Donald Trump, so is it true, are these tiles were they hand-drawn by Walt Disney? And Trump said, does it matter? And that, I think, is at the heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about Putin, when we're talking about 21st century forms of censorship which come from 21st century forms of despots and dictators. Thank you.
Thank you.